August 15, 1945, Victory over Japan Day. Across the American mainland, sirens wailed and ticker tape rained down from office buildings as millions celebrated the end of the bloodiest war in human history. In prisoner of war camps from California to Georgia, Japanese soldiers and civilians prepared for the long journey back to their defeated empire. But in a small, secluded facility near Fort Lawton, Washington, something extraordinary was unfolding. When American officers informed a group of Japanese women prisoners that arrangements were being made for their repatriation, several of them responded with tears not of joy, but of anguish. They did not want to go home. These were not ordinary prisoners of war. They were members of the Japanese Women's Volunteer Labor Corps, captured during the final chaotic months of the Pacific Campaign. Young women who had served the empire in administrative and support roles, now facing a decision that would reshape their entire existence. What could possibly compel someone to choose continued captivity over freedom in their own country? Before we explore this remarkable story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The journey began 9 months earlier, in November of 1944, when the first transport of Japanese women arrived at the makeshift compound. Unlike the massive camps housing male prisoners, this facility held fewer than 50 women, ranging in age from 19 to 38. They had been captured on various Pacific islands as American forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands, serving as clerks, translators, and communications operators for Imperial military units. Captain Vera Sutton, one of only a handful of female officers assigned to prisoner operations in the Pacific Northwest, remembered the morning the transport trucks arrived. The women descended from the vehicles with expressions that mixed defiance with profound exhaustion. They wore the remnants of their khaki service uniforms, some still bearing the cherry blossom insignia they had once displayed with such pride. Among them was 23-year-old Chieko Matsuda, a former signals operator from Yokohama. She had joined the Volunteer Corps in 1943, believing she was fulfilling her duty to protect her family and homeland. Now, standing on American soil as a prisoner, she clutched a small silk pouch containing a photograph of her parents and younger brother, the only tangible link to the life she had known. The first days were marked by rigid silence. The Japanese women maintained strict discipline among themselves, speaking only in hushed conversations during meals. They followed camp protocols with mechanical precision, their faces carefully composed masks that revealed nothing of their inner turmoil. Captain Sutton observed how they moved with a military bearing that seemed almost defiant, as if captivity could not diminish the dignity they carried within themselves. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, fear and uncertainty churned like a dark current. Chieko lay awake most nights on her narrow bunk, listening to the quiet sobbing of other women who thought darkness would hide their tears. They had all been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death, that American soldiers were brutal savages who would show no mercy to their enemies. Yet the reality they encountered contradicted everything they had been told. The guards were professional, even distant, but not cruel. No one had been beaten or tortured. The barracks were clean and heated against the autumn chill. Meals arrived with predictable regularity, simple but adequate portions of food that, while unfamiliar, were not deliberately insufficient. This unexpected treatment created its own form of psychological torture. The women had prepared themselves for suffering, for proof that their propaganda had been true. Instead, they found themselves in a strange liminal space where the enemy refused to behave like enemies. It was profoundly disorienting. Noriko Tanabe, a 27-year-old former administrative clerk from Osaka, found the kindness almost unbearable. She had lost her husband at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier and had joined the Volunteer Corps partly from genuine patriotism and partly from having nothing left to lose. She had expected that capture would mean a quick death, perhaps a merciful end to grief that never seemed to diminish. Instead, she found herself trapped in a routine of meaningless days, neither alive nor dead, neither free nor destroyed. The camp routine was structured but not harsh. Morning roll call at 7 o'clock, followed by breakfast in the mess hall. Work assignments that included laundry duties, kitchen assistance, and maintenance of the barracks. Lunch at noon, then afternoon work periods, or supervised recreation time in the small yard. Dinner at 6 o'clock, evening roll call at 8, lights out at 9:30. It was monotonous, boring even, but it was also strangely safe in its predictability. Captain Sutton struggled with her own conflicted feelings about her assignment. She had lost a brother at Iwo Jima just 6 months earlier, and the grief was still raw and immediate. Part of her wanted to hate these women, to see them as complicit in her brother's death and the deaths of so many American boys. But when she looked at their faces, she saw not monsters, but young women who seemed just as lost and frightened as she felt. The cultural barrier seemed insurmountable. None of the guards spoke Japanese, and only 2 of the prisoners, including Chieko, had studied any English before the war. Communication happened mostly through gestures and the universal language of routine. Questions were asked through pantomime, answers given with nods or shakes of the head. It was a strange, silent dance between captors and captives, neither side quite sure how to navigate this unprecedented situation. The first crack in the wall of silence came in late November, as autumn rain turned to early snow. Private Frank Nishimura, a Japanese-American soldier from Sacramento, had been assigned to the facility precisely because of his language skills. His parents had immigrated before he was born, and he had grown up speaking both English and Japanese at home. He represented everything the Japanese prisoners had been taught to despise, a man of Japanese blood who had chosen to serve the enemy. Yet it was Nishimura who would become the unexpected bridge between 2 worlds. He began by simply greeting the women in Japanese during morning roll call. "Good morning," he would say, his accent carrying the slight California inflection that marked him as foreign, despite his fluent vocabulary. At first, the women refused to acknowledge him, turning their faces away as if his very existence was an insult to their heritage. But Nishimura was patient. He had faced prejudice from both sides of this war, Japanese who saw him as a traitor, and Americans who saw him as the enemy despite his uniform. He understood the complexity of divided loyalties better than most. One morning, he noticed Reiko Ando, a slight woman of 21 who had served as a translator in the Philippines, shivering violently during roll call. The temperature had dropped overnight, and her thin uniform jacket provided little protection against the bitter wind sweeping across the compound. Without a word, Nishimura disappeared into the guards' quarters and returned with a heavy wool blanket. He approached Reiko slowly, holding out the blanket with both hands, in a gesture that was almost ceremonial. She stared at him with wide, confused eyes. Her entire body tensed, as if preparing for some kind of trick or trap. But Nishimura simply placed the blanket over her shoulders and stepped back, saying quietly in Japanese, "Winter here is harsh. Please stay warm." Reiko's hands came up reflexively to clutch the blanket, and for just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked. Tears welled in her eyes before she blinked them away fiercely. She gave the smallest bow, a gesture so brief that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. But Nishimura saw it, and he understood what it meant. It was an acknowledgement of shared humanity, the first tentative step across the gulf that separated them. Word of this small kindness spread through the barracks that night. The women whispered about it in their bunks, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with everything they had been taught about Americans, and especially about Japanese who served them. Chieko lay awake thinking about the blanket, about the careful respect in Nishimura's gesture, about the way he had spoken to Reiko in their own language, not with mockery, but with genuine concern. She thought about her brother, who would be about Nishimura's age if he had survived the war. Would her brother have shown such kindness to an enemy? Would she herself have done so before her capture? The questions kept her awake long after the barracks fell silent around her. December arrived with heavy snow that blanketed the compound in white silence. The approaching holidays created tension among the American staff, who struggled with how to observe Christmas and New Year while overseeing enemy prisoners. Captain Sutton consulted with her superiors and made a decision that would prove transformative. She would allow a modest celebration, not as a reward, but as a recognition of shared humanity during a season traditionally devoted to peace. The kitchen staff prepared a special meal for December 24th. Turkey with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread arrived in the mess hall on that cold evening. But it was the dessert that would become legendary in the camp's brief history. The cooks had prepared dozens of American apple pies, their crusts golden brown and fragrant with cinnamon, steam still rising from the lattice tops. When the pies were brought into the mess hall, the Japanese women stared in confusion and wonder. None of them had ever seen such a dessert before. The combination of flaky pastry and cooked fruit was utterly foreign to their culinary experience. The sweet, spiced aroma filled the room, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Sergeant James Brennan, a farm boy from Iowa who had learned some basic Japanese phrases from Nishimura, stood before the assembled prisoners and attempted to explain in broken Japanese and enthusiastic gestures. "American apple pie," he said, holding up a slice. "Christmas tradition. We share with friends." The word friends hung in the air like a question mark. Could enemies become friends over a piece of pie? The concept seemed absurd, yet here were their captors offering them something that clearly held significance beyond mere food: Captain Sutton had made a deliberate choice in how the pie would be served. Rather than having the guards distribute it, she invited the women to come forward themselves and take a slice. It was a small gesture of trust and acknowledgement that they were not animals to be fed, but human beings capable of making choices. Chieko was among the first to approach the table. She studied the pie carefully, noting the intricate lattice pattern on top, the way the filling bubbled slightly at the edges, the scent that reminded her somehow of autumn festivals back home, even though the specific smells were completely unfamiliar. She accepted a slice on a plain white plate, along with a fork that felt awkward in her hand after months of eating with chopsticks or her fingers. She returned to her seat and cut a small piece with the fork, bringing it to her mouth with careful deliberation. The moment the pie touched her tongue, something shifted inside her. The sweetness was unlike anything in Japanese cuisine, less delicate than their traditional sweets, but somehow more generous, more abundant. The apples were soft but not mushy, the crust buttery and crisp. But more than the taste itself, it was the gesture that overwhelmed her. This was not prisoner rations. This was food meant to bring joy, to celebrate, to share. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Noriko Tanabe sat with her slice of pie untouched for several long minutes, staring at it as if it might reveal some hidden truth. She had been taught that Americans were wasteful, decadent, concerned only with material excess, while Japanese cultivated spiritual discipline. Yet this pie, with its careful construction and deliberate seasoning, spoke of a different kind of attention. Someone had taken time to create something beautiful and delicious, not for themselves, but to share with prisoners, with enemies, with people they had no obligation to treat with anything beyond basic necessities required by international law. When she finally took a bite, tears began streaming down her face. She made no sound, but the tears kept coming, running down her cheeks and dropping onto the plate. The woman beside her, Reiko Ando, reached out and gently touched her shoulder. They sat together in silence, eating pie and crying quietly, mourning something neither could quite name. Perhaps it was the loss of certainty, the collapse of the clear moral universe they had inhabited before capture. Or perhaps it was grief for all the years of hatred and killing, for all the young men on both sides who had died believing the other side was inhuman and monstrous. Private Nishimura watched from his position near the door and felt his own throat tighten with emotion. He had grown up eating his mother's apple pie, a recipe she had learned from American neighbors who had welcomed his immigrant family despite prejudice from others. When the war started and his family was sent to an internment camp, those same neighbors had protested, had kept their house and belongings safe, had written letters to politicians demanding justice. His mother had baked apple pie in the camp kitchen whenever ingredients were available, a stubborn insistence that American identity and Japanese heritage could coexist in the same person, in the same heart. Now, watching these Japanese women experience apple pie for the first time, he understood what his mother had been trying to teach him. Food could be a bridge across impossible divides. After the meal ended, something fundamental had changed in the camp's atmosphere. The rigid silence that had characterized the first month began to crack. Women who had previously avoided eye contact with guards now offered small nods of acknowledgement. During work details, some began attempting English phrases they had overheard, their pronunciation hesitant but their effort genuine. Chieko found herself drawn to the small camp library, a corner of the recreation building that housed perhaps 200 books in English. She could read basic English from her school studies, though her vocabulary was limited. She began selecting children's books, simple stories with pictures that helped her understand words she did not know. Captain Sutton noticed her there one afternoon and brought her a Japanese-English dictionary that had been gathering dust in the camp office. For learning, the captain said simply, placing the worn volume on the table beside Chieko. Chieko looked up at her, this woman who had every reason to hate her, and saw something in Captain Sutton's eyes that she had not expected to find. Recognition, not as enemy to enemy, but as one human being acknowledging another. January of 1945 brought news that would shake the foundation of everything the Japanese women believed about their homeland. The International Red Cross began delivering letters that had been held in processing for months, correspondence from Japan that painted a picture of devastation beyond anything the prisoners had imagined. Chieko received a letter from a neighbor in Yokohama, written in October of the previous year. Her hands trembled as she read the cramped characters describing how American firebombing had destroyed most of their neighborhood. Her family's house was gone. Her parents had evacuated to the countryside, but her younger brother Takeshi had been conscripted and sent to an unknown destination. No one had heard from him in 8 months. The neighbor's final paragraph struck her with the force of a physical blow. She wrote that many people in their community now questioned whether the war had ever been justified, whether the sacrifices demanded of them had served any purpose beyond the ambitions of military leaders who themselves remained safe, while ordinary families lost everything. Noriko's letter came from a cousin in Osaka. It was even more devastating. Her cousin wrote that the city had been reduced to rubble by repeated bombing raids. Food was scarce to the point of starvation. People were eating tree bark and grass to survive. But worse than the physical destruction was the psychological collapse. Her cousin described how neighborhood associations that had once enforced patriotic fervor with rigid discipline were now falling apart as people focused solely on survival. The unity and purpose that had defined Japanese society during the early war years had dissolved into desperate individualism. Trust between neighbors had evaporated as people informed on each other to gain favor with authorities or access to rations. Reiko received no letter at all, which was perhaps worse than bad news. She had family in Hiroshima and had heard nothing from them since before her capture. The silence suggested possibilities too terrible to contemplate. She spent long hours sitting alone in the barracks, staring at nothing, her face empty of expression. The women gathered in small groups to share and discuss their letters, their voices hushed and strained. They had been taught that Japan was winning the war, that American victories were temporary setbacks, that the homeland remained strong and united in resolve. Now they confronted evidence that contradicted every aspect of that narrative. Their country was not strong but broken, not united but fragmenting, not winning but clearly losing in ways that would leave scars for generations. Private Nishimura was called upon to translate several letters for women whose Japanese literacy was limited. He found the work emotionally exhausting. These were descriptions of suffering inflicted partly by his fellow Americans, yet he could not help but feel compassion for the women receiving such news. War was revealing itself as a machine that devoured everyone, regardless of which side they served. Captain Sutton observed how the letters transformed the prisoners' demeanor. The military bearing they had maintained began to crumble. The winter of 1945 wore on with increasing tension as rumors of Japan's imminent defeat spread through the compound. By February, even the most optimistic among the Japanese women could no longer deny the trajectory of the war. American newspapers available in the camp library carried stories of island after island falling to Allied forces, of Japanese cities burning, of a homeland that seemed to be collapsing under the weight of its own exhausted resistance. The women faced a psychological crisis that went beyond simple defeat. They had to reconcile the Japan they had believed in with the Japan that actually existed. They had served what they thought was a noble cause, only to discover that the cause had been built on lies and maintained through propaganda that bore no relationship to reality. Chieko spent hours in the library reading American accounts of the war and comparing them to what she had been taught. The discrepancies were profound and disturbing. Battles, she had been told, where great Japanese victories had actually been catastrophic defeats. Military leaders she had revered were described in American sources as incompetent or fanatical, willing to sacrifice unlimited lives for symbolic gestures. Most troubling were the reports about Japanese treatment of prisoners and conquered populations. Stories emerged of atrocities in China, of brutal treatment of Allied prisoners, of forced labor and systematic cruelty. The American articles could be propaganda themselves, Chieko knew, but the sheer volume and consistency of the accounts suggested an underlying truth she could not ignore. She thought about the apple pie, about Private Nishimura's kindness with the blanket, about Captain Sutton's quiet respect. If Americans treated their enemies with such decency, what did that say about the side she had served? The question haunted her through sleepless nights. In March, Captain Sutton organized a series of meetings to prepare the women for eventual repatriation. She explained that when the war ended, arrangements would be made to return them to Japan through neutral countries or Red Cross channels. She spoke matter-of-factly about logistics and timelines, but Chieko noticed something in the captain's tone, a hesitation that suggested she understood repatriation was not the simple blessing it might appear to be. After one such meeting, Noriko approached Chieko in the barracks. They had become close over the winter months, two women trying to make sense of circumstances that seemed to make no sense at all. Noriko spoke quietly so others would not overhear. "What if we do not want to go back?" she asked. "What if there is nothing left to go back to?" Chieko had been thinking the same thing, but had not dared voice it aloud. To even consider not returning felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything they had been raised to believe. A Japanese person belonged in Japan, served Japan, defined themselves entirely through their relationship to the homeland and the emperor. To choose otherwise was to become something they had no name for, something outside the boundaries of acceptable identity. Yet the thought persisted. Here in this camp, they had found something unexpected, not just safety or adequate food, but a kind of human dignity that their own military had never offered them. April brought cherry blossom season, and with it, an almost unbearable irony. Mrs. Hazel Patterson, a local civilian volunteer who had been visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, arrived one morning with branches cut from flowering cherry trees in her garden. She had heard from Private Nishimura that the Japanese prisoners might appreciate seeing sakura, even here in captivity, so far from home. The branches were arranged in simple vases throughout the common areas. When the women saw them, many wept openly. The delicate pink blossoms represented everything they had lost, every spring festival they would never attend again, every memory of childhood and family that seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. But Mrs. Patterson's gesture also represented something else, a recognition that their grief mattered, that their homesickness was valid even though they were enemies. Chieko found herself in conversation with Mrs. Patterson during one of her visits. The older woman spoke slowly and used simple English words, while Chieko struggled to express complex thoughts with her limited vocabulary. Mrs. Patterson had lost a son at Pearl Harbor, a fact she mentioned without drama or accusation. Yet here she was, bringing cherry blossoms to Japanese prisoners, treating them with a kindness that transcended her own grief. Why? Chieko finally asked, the single word, carrying the weight of everything she could not articulate. Why do you show us kindness when we are your enemy? Mrs. Patterson considered the question carefully before responding. Because hatred is exhausting, she said simply. Because my son would not want me to spend the rest of my life bitter and angry. Because you are not the ones who killed him, you are just young women who got caught up in something bigger than yourselves. The conversation stayed with Chieko long after Mrs. Patterson left. She realized that forgiveness was not something that could be demanded or expected, but something that individuals chose to offer, despite having every right to withhold it. The Americans were teaching her something profound about the possibility of redemption, about the human capacity to see past labels like enemy and prisoner, to recognize shared humanity. On May 8th, news arrived that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. American staff celebrated cautiously, aware that their own war in the Pacific continued. But everyone in the camp understood that Japan's defeat was now inevitable. It was only a matter of time, and that time was growing shorter with each passing day. Captain Sutton called another meeting to discuss repatriation procedures. This time, her presentation was interrupted by something unprecedented. Chieko stood up, her legs shaking, but her voice steady. "Captain Sutton," she said in her careful English, "may I ask a question that is difficult?" The captain nodded, curious and somewhat concerned about what might come next. Chieko took a deep breath and asked the question that had been building inside her for months. If some of us do not wish to return to Japan immediately, if we wish to stay here longer, is this possible? The room fell completely silent. Every eye turned toward Chieko, some of the Japanese women looking shocked, others nodding slowly as if she had voiced a thought they had been afraid to express. Captain Sutton's expression revealed her own surprise at the question. Captain Sutton requested 24 hours to consider the unprecedented request and to consult with her superiors. That night, the barracks erupted in heated discussions among the Japanese women. Some were horrified by Chieko's question, viewing it as a betrayal of their duty and identity. Others admitted they had been harboring similar thoughts, but lacked the courage to speak them aloud. Noriko stood firmly beside Chieko, as did Reiko. Together, the three of them articulated arguments that gradually swayed others to at least consider the possibility. What exactly were they returning to? Their letters had painted pictures of a devastated homeland where survival itself was uncertain. Many had lost contact with their families entirely and had no way of knowing who, if anyone, was waiting for their return. More fundamentally, they had undergone transformations during their captivity that made them question everything they had once believed. Could they return to a society that would view them as failures, as prisoners who had been corrupted by enemy influence? The response from Captain Sutton's superiors took 3 days rather than 1. The War Department was uncertain how to handle such an unusual request. Legally, the women were prisoners of war, entitled to repatriation no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Emperor Hirohito's radio address, played through scratchy recordings and translated by Private Nishimura, spoke of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable. The women understood with painful clarity what those words meant. They would have to forge new identities from the ruins of everything they had once believed. The final repatriation day was scheduled for September 10, 1945. The 28 women who had chosen to return to Japan gathered their few belongings and prepared for the long journey home. The scene was unlike any standard prisoner release. There were no celebrations, no sense of triumph or liberation. Instead, the atmosphere resembled a family gathering where loved ones were parting ways, perhaps forever. Captain Sutton addressed both groups, those leaving and those staying. Her voice carried emotion she did not try to hide. "You came here as our enemies," she told them. "You leave as something we never expected. As friends, as people who have taught us that redemption is possible even in the darkest circumstances. I hope those returning to Japan will carry with them memories of the kindness you received here, and that you will work to build bridges of understanding between our countries." Chieko, now serving as translator for the group, responded on behalf of all the women. "Captain Sutton, we arrived believing we knew what America represented. We learned that we understood nothing. We thought Americans were our enemies. We discovered that the real enemy was our own ignorance and the propaganda that shaped our beliefs. Some of us returned to Japan to help rebuild. Others stay here to build new lives. But all of us carry forward the lesson that former enemies can become friends when people choose compassion over hatred." The women who were leaving boarded transport trucks that would take them to the port in Seattle. They carried with them letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, and small gifts that represented the unexpected friendships they had formed. More importantly, they carried a transformed understanding of what America and Americans actually were, knowledge that would serve them well in occupied Japan, where cooperation with former enemies would become essential for survival and reconstruction. For the 17 women who stayed, the transition from prisoners to immigrants proved both challenging and rewarding. Chieko found employment as a translator for the military government offices processing displaced persons and occupation under the Geneva Convention. But nothing in international law addressed what to do when prisoners actively requested to remain in captivity. Eventually, a compromise solution emerged. The women would not be permitted to remain as prisoners indefinitely, but those who wished to delay their repatriation could apply for reclassification as displaced persons. This would allow them to remain in the United States temporarily while exploring possibilities for immigration, employment, and permanent resettlement. However, they would no longer be housed at government expense. They would need to find sponsors, secure jobs, and establish themselves independently in American communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. The announcement created a clear division among the prisoners. 28 women chose immediate repatriation, unwilling to abandon their homeland despite its current condition. They would return to Japan and face whatever circumstances they found there with courage and dignity. But 17 women, led by Chieko, Noriko, and Reiko, chose to accept the uncertainty of attempting to build new lives in America. The choice was agonizing for everyone involved. Those who chose to stay were not rejecting Japan out of hatred or contempt, but out of a painful recognition that the Japan they had served no longer existed, perhaps had never existed as they imagined it. Those who chose to return were not foolish or blind to reality, but felt a deep obligation to participate in their country's reconstruction rather than abandoning it in its darkest hour. Both choices required tremendous courage. The process of finding sponsors proved surprisingly straightforward in some cases and impossibly difficult in others. Mrs. Hazel Patterson immediately offered to sponsor Chieko, providing housing and helping her search for employment. The fact that Mrs. Patterson had lost her son to Japanese attack yet was willing to open her home to a Japanese woman became a local news story that generated both support and controversy. Dr. Robert Hayes, the camp physician, had been impressed by Reiko's careful attention when she assisted in the medical facility. He arranged for her to continue training as a nurse's aide at Seattle General Hospital, personally vouching for her character despite the prejudice she would inevitably face. August 15, 1945 arrived with the news everyone had been anticipating. Japan had surrendered. The war was finally over. In the camp outside Fort Lawton, the announcement created a complex mixture of relief and grief. The killing would stop, but Japan's defeat was absolute and unconditional. For the Japanese women, the moment was profoundly bittersweet. The country they had served, paperwork. Her unique perspective, as someone who had experienced both sides of the conflict, made her invaluable in bridging cultural misunderstandings. She lived with Mrs. Hazel Patterson for 2 years, and their relationship evolved from sponsor and dependent to genuine friendship between equals. The loss Mrs. Patterson had suffered at Pearl Harbor never disappeared. But she found that helping Chieko build a new life brought meaning to her son's death in ways that hatred never could. Noriko secured work at a Seattle textile factory, her organizational skills and attention to detail quickly earning respect from supervisors and co-workers. She faced prejudice and suspicion from some quarters,